Hello and welcome to the Vestibular Disorders Association, Making Vestibular Visible. I'm Dr. Kathleen Stross, a vestibular physical therapist and volunteer with VITA. This segment is sponsored by UprightVR, portable technology used to assess and rehabilitate those at a high risk of falling. Can virtual reality really help with vestibular healthcare? Well, today we'll be talking with researcher, neuroscientist, engineer, and inventor of the UprightVR, Geoff Wright, and physical therapists who use this technology, Bridgett, Wallace, and Ramiro, Maldonado, about this new, affordable, ultra-portable, scientifically validated virtual reality solution for assessing fall risk, identifying causes, and shaping treatments. Welcome, everyone, to Making Vestibular Visible. How are you guys doing?
Hi,
Geoff, start by telling us how you came up with the idea for using virtual reality to assess fall risk or in this vestibular population.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So as with most ideas, it goes through many evolutions and development, but I started using virtual reality technology back in the 90s when it was still quite expensive, maybe $50,000 for a headset. And so all of it was really high level and in well-funded labs in order to do this. But problem was it not only was it expensive, but it didn't have a lot of the tracking devices that are needed. So fast forward 15 years, and in the 2010s, the gamers, the video gamers started getting involved, and that brought the price down significantly. They put out an amazing, I think Oculus was one of the first ones that sort of removed the ceiling. And one of the headsets they had really had built-in inertial measurement units. These are gyroscopes and accelerometers and some of the tracking technology. And it occurred to me after training with posturographers like Faye Horak and Victor Gerfinkel that we could use these headsets in order to track movement of the head, which then we use some mathematics to figure out how we can track this and use this quantitatively. The benefit of the virtual reality headset is it gives you a visual stimulus, which is extremely important for maintaining balance. There's three aspects to postural control: vestibular system, your visual system, and your touch sensation, somatosensory system. But the virtual reality really lets you manipulate the visual information, affects balance, and then we can measure it just using that headset. And so the ideas kind of evolved through the evolution of technology, and then my training in with physical therapists and with engineers and other neuroscientists.
Sounds like the vestibular system lends itself to recreation with engineering, math, and science, right? Because it's sort of this internal gyroscope that seems to make sense when you explain it as an engineer.
When I tell people my first degree is in aerospace engineering, they ask me, how did you ever get involved in human balance science? And it's like, well, we've got a gyroscope in our ear and accelerometers. So it all like makes sense in my head, but I guess it's also makes sense in your head too, it sounds like.
Well, it does. I have an engineering background as well. And I was like, yeah, we're modeled after all of that math. It's all math. That's awesome. So this product, a key part of it is analyzing all this information that's coming in. How does that work? You're not putting electrodes inside the brain. You're not putting them inside the ear. How are you gathering information through the goggles?
Yeah, so in these virtual reality headsets, there are these accelerometers and gyros, and there's these cameras that are called inside-out tracking cameras that basically can measure how far you are, how much you move, without even needing external cameras to do that.
So start with the accelerometers and tell us what that means. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So accelerometers basically measure how fast you're moving. So it's almost like a speedometer, except it's measuring acceleration. And we also have those in our ear, but we have them in these headset as well. So these accelerometers can detect whether you're moving forward and backward and whether you're tilting in a gravity field, meaning on Earth there's gravity, and if you tilt an accelerometer, it tells you that you're tilting.
Okay, so it's measuring the head movements and of the person who's wearing it, plus whether they're moving their whole body through space.
Yeah, and that's an assumption that we make, is that yes, your head can move independent of your body, but we use what's commonly called an inverted single link inverted pendulum model, and that just means, that's a fancy word for saying, if this is my body and this is my head, when my body moves around as if I'm swaying, then my head actually represents what my whole body is doing. And so we make that assumption, and the clinical user actually has to recognize that if the person is looking around sort of voluntarily, then that negates that test, and we say, you got to do that test over again, but we give good instructions, and usually pretty easy instruction to follow.
So it measures the accelerometers, and then the next ones, it keep going then.
Yeah, so then it also measures tilt, because there's these gyroscopes in there. Then those are just basically tilt detectors. And then the last thing, which is really the most important, is those inside out tracking cameras. And really all that's doing is it's using depth information in the visual environment to determine how much this headset has moved, and this headset's attached to your head, and how much it has moved in space. And we can get very precise, down to about a couple millimeters of how much movement your body has made, even when it's really minute movements.
In forward direction and inside, so it has these inside out cameras in the side and the front.
Yeah.
And how far do you have to be away from your data point to be able to detect that?
Well, we usually ask people to create a radius of about 3 feet, so about 6 feet of space is what's needed. And so you don't want to be standing directly in front of a wall. You want to give yourself 3 to 6 feet from a wall. And you also want to make sure that there's some depth information. So you can see there's stuff in my background, and that tells these cameras where your head is in space. And so it really helps with the accuracy of the information.
So what are the tests based on? You know, you mentioned 3 systems we use for balance, and therapists watching will recognize the sensory integration tests and limits of stability tests. We're talking about sway and what system in your nervous system you're using for balance. How does your Upright VR use what we know about sensory integration?
Yeah, so we are able to manipulate vision. We also use a standard clinical piece of tool, which is that blue foam, that RX foam that everybody has in their clinic, and that helps with reducing the reliability of the somatosensory feedback from the feet. And so we can manipulate that aspect, the visual aspect. And interestingly, by using certain visual scenes in the virtual environment that are dynamic, that interferes with your vestibular system. Now, it's not directly changing your vestibular system. It's integrating in your brainstem with your visual system, and it can cause changes in how your vestibular nuclei are processing information. So we can actually hit all 3 of those primary senses and the central integration of them, where that happens a lot. It starts in your brainstem, but it also happens in some of your higher levels of your brain, your cortex and parietal areas and vestibular insular cortex. So a lot of different areas can be affected by how we're manipulating these 3 different senses.
By manipulating them, we can learn what the patient can use, what they can't use, and maybe what that would help direct therapy. Ramiro, you've used this product in your clinic, and can you take us through what a typical testing session would look like using UprightVR?
Sure, of course. And, just to be 100% fair, so I am the director of business development for UprightVR. So a lot of my clinic uses has been with training clinicians on how to use it. Although I have used it on patients in that context. So a typical kind of training session, what I, really, because again, my background as a vestibular physical therapist, I was lucky enough to use tools like the Neurocom and various force plates and things of that nature. What I love about the virtual headset is the fact that it's one piece of equipment. one piece of equipment that I could put onto my patient, which really helps me to standardize the process. I don't have to worry about multiple other pieces of equipment to set up to the patient or my client. Also, there's as we go through the test, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well, but it's even standardized further, where before every single condition that we put a patient through, we have a standardized narrator that'll explain exactly what that patient is going to expect during that scene, and how to kind of prepare themselves for it. And often it's just kind of like, this is what's going to happen in this condition, whether it's an eyes open, eyes closed condition, for instance. And then what we want you to do, which is always just try to stay as still as possible and stay looking upright and forward. So that's kind of, a lot of things that I love about it. The fact that it's standardized, and you could just kind of run a patient through it to get a very high level balance assessment.
We haven't mentioned it, but I'm assuming, is this done always in standing, or is it ever done in sitting?
Correct. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, just like most physical therapists, we could all get probably pretty creative in certain ways. You could probably, use it to maybe intuit some ideas, but for the standardized version of the test, you would definitely be using it in a standing condition. So you'd have to be standing for the test. The test itself takes about 10 minutes to perform, and that's because there's 8 different conditions presented in a virtual reality environment. It's truly 4 different conditions, just performed twice on firm ground and then repeated on foam. So we could then get our ratios, which will then give us the scores for each one of the components of balance. So the test takes about 10 minutes, and that includes the narrator describing the test, you discussing with your patient what to expect during the test, should there be any kind of rest periods they need. It takes about 10 minutes to perform. And for people that are kind of familiar with the world of vestibular testing, which I'm sure a lot of clinicians and maybe even patients are, those conditions are eyes open, firm ground, eyes closed, firm ground. And then we get into the fancy spaces where it's a sway reference locked. What that means is the visual surround is locked in place on that individual. So no matter how much they sway, it'll look like the room is still fixed in front of them. So again, giving us very good information when we give them faulty visual information. And then finally, what we do that's very kind of unique to our device is we have something called a spin scenario, where we actually spin the environment in the role plane for that person. And again, we repeat that on foam, and that's how we get really nice and accurate visual and vestibular integration issues. If there's any kind of mismatch there, that'll be the condition that helps us to really tease that out. So, for the test, like as Dr. Wright was mentioning, about 6 feet of diameter space. So I always like to prepare my area first. What's also very nice about the test is, how well thought through I think the product is. And the very first condition isn't just kind of throwing you right into the test. The very first condition really is, hey, you're in a virtual reality environment. Why don't you have a look around, get used to what's going on in this space before you even start the test. And this I find is extremely useful in building rapport and trust with our patients, letting them know.
What are they looking at to introduce them to that concept? Because it's an unusual experience. The first time you put it on, you'll always remember that first time. In my house, it was in a shark tank, I think. They put it on me, and I was put underwater in a shark cage.
That's pretty terrifying, but nowhere near that terrifying. I feel like it's and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Wright, but I was just assumed as a little bit of an homage to like your research, because of the fact the environment that we put them in is a space capsule, which is out in space. So you're in this like cool rocket ship in space, and you're looking out this beautiful window, and you get to see the Earth in the background and the stars and the star systems. And I just that was my assumption. I don't know if I'm right on that assumption or not, but that's what I kind of figured.
Well, it kind of was, yeah. Because one place that you would be able to spin without questioning why am I spinning upside down is in weightlessness. And also that's where I got to experience some of my postural illusions is on these parabolic flights that NASA does.
Yes.
And I went on those during grad school, and we did research on them. And that's where a lot of these visual vestibular mismatch ideas were. I got to experience them firsthand, so it shaped where I went from there.
As the assisting therapist, do you have to be ready for that response when they first experience that virtual reality environment? And have you seen any, interesting responses?
Oh yeah, and I mean, I can speak from my experience. I mean, it is a provocative test, right? We're introducing new conditions for people, and people who have deficits, they could potentially, have a fall in this kind of situation. So that's why, again, we always want to we focus a lot on environment when it comes to testing, right? So you have your the space that you want to do it within. Often there's a chair set up right there as well. But also being mindful of any kind of tactile influence that you can give to your patients, because that's also something that can keep a person upright, and you don't want to negate anything in the test. So we use these gait belts that have these nice loops on the side of them, so we could just kind of put our hand into the loop, not provide any tactile feedback. But should I at any moment feel like, oh, I'm going to have to intervene physically with this individual, I can quickly grab the gait belt and guide them into the chair, or just steady them, or whatever it may be. To that point, if clinicians that are using this product, if they happen to have harnessing systems at their locations, things like a solo step or any number of harnessing systems that exist, you could always ensure your patient safety by setting them up in a harnessing system like that as well. But to that point, I mean, we don't allow someone necessarily to fall, right? When we practice good safe guarding techniques, enough room to allow them to find their limits of stability during that test. But again, if I just feel like they're excursioning a bit too much, then I can always put hands on them. Always have the individual close their eyes or take the headset off if it's too provocative at any point. There's a lot of safeguards that we could put around it to make sure that the test is safe for the individual. So luckily, no issues with me as far as a true fall, but things that we would mark as a fall would be if they had to take a step, if they couldn't complete a trial because it was just too stimulating for them, or the fact if I had to physically intervene, I would mark that as a fall on the testing platform, so that I could get accurate results out of my assessment at the end.
Excellent. So in about 10 to 15 minutes, start to finish, you have a lot of information that you can use in the clinic. Bridgett, you've used this in your clinic. Tell us about that experience and what kind of differences you've seen. And then I know I want to talk about validation of results, but I want to just keep us in the image of the patient gets tested and you use it. And how does that help you?
Yeah. Well, thanks. And thanks for having me. Kathleen, you and I have known each other for many years now, So,
you can't tell us, I don't know how old we are.
And just also, there's a couple of questions that I don't want people to miss that I can wrap up, address your question. And then, I see a couple of questions that some of the attendees have asked. Yeah. So, I started with Neurocom, and I've been in this space for about 30 years, and also have the Bertec unit, and now UprightVR, and it's really been interesting. I certainly don't have the history that Dr. Wright has in VR, but I've been following it, and so it's exciting to see, how far the gaming industry has brought this type of technology, and now you have people like Geoff who are making it more rehab based, because it was such a gaming. It wasn't made for people with dizziness and balance disorders. And so now we see that focused research on how we can use this to help people. So I think from a business owner, because I'm also a business owner, I would say that a couple of bonuses are affordability and portability. And I think that's what, so many of us are looking for as business owners. And that's been, that's nice, because there's a big cost difference when we're looking at this type of testing capabilities. I love the report writing. Staff loves the report writing. It's real easy to turn around and turn those reports into a patient's story. So I think that's one of those, unknowns. You don't really realize how beneficial that those reports can be, and when you can just sit down and have an easy conversation with a patient and go over their test results. I've really appreciated all the time that must have been spent into coming up with the reports. I think from a clinician, what I have really been surprised about is it's what Ramiro, it's what Geoff, it's even Kathleen, it's what you mentioned about, we're all used to this terminology about sensory organization and integration. And I think one of what can be challenging is when patients, they're testing, when I say they're testing is normal, maybe we test their strength and their sensation and it's normal. We look at their inner ear and maybe there's some impairments there. Their visual system's intact. And so we see what we call the sensory reweighting dysfunction, where you may have all the pieces, but the way your brain puts it all together isn't there. So we get visually induced dizziness, visual motion sensitivity, kind of unexplained falls. We see this in different diagnoses, like we may see this in 3PD. And the second that someone puts the headset on, I would say the majority of the patients that I've tested is you can see kind of that startle response come out that, oh my gosh. And even though their strength and sensation is intact, they're not tapping into it. So just putting the goggles on, and I think that is invaluable because it's not just a way we can assess people, but when you think about the treatment outcomes, it doesn't mean that it has to be a big, busy environment of something that's going to make someone sick. It could be an environment that's calming, and we get the patient calm and teaching them how to tap into somatosensory, because now they don't have that visual representation, and that is priceless because we're really, one of the challenges, how do we down-regulate the brain relying so much on vision and up-regulate somatosensory? So we know how to down-regulate that sympathetic nervous system. And the research has shown that patients aren't using their inner ear when they need to, or they're not using somatosensory when they need to. So maybe they're in their amygdala, maybe they're in fight or flight, and their visual system when they should be using their feet. And I think there's some untapped opportunities with this type of technology because it takes away the world as we know it in no other way. And so I think I'm just excited about like what I don't know yet about this technology. I think there's some real opportunities there. So I'm excited.
You said a lot there, and I could go on for about an hour about just understanding. I mean, the neuroscience of it is fascinating to me. I think that we, in testing and treatment, we remove information, but people are getting sensory stimulation all the time, and teaching the brain to be aware of things in our environment, but recognize what requires a response and what doesn't require a response. And I think that's what you're saying, and it's really exciting and interesting about that. What is the ideal patient that you find you use it for, or is it a part of your typical assessment? Obviously, these patients have to be able to stand independently. They're ambulatory patients, right? They're how do you use it in which population specifically?
Since in the clinic, all we see is dizziness and balance disorders. That's the only population that we see. And some I do on a small, low profile force plate, Bertec force plate, like a modified CAT sib. And then some I do in the Bertec unit, the CDP, because this is newer technology that we're incorporating into our equipment, into our clinic. So I think, I'm on a learning curve myself, but seeing how many patients that we have who need to down-regulate the reliance on vision and up-regulate somatosensory, those are the patients I really want in this device, because they know right away. They're standing there, they've got normal strength and sensation, and they put them on and they're just like, and then we can talk about that startle response and how they're in fight or flight. And we got to, so I think everyone that presents that way is a candidate.
And likely, because you're talking about falls and targeting falls, we're talking about every community dwelling elder that could benefit from a fall assessment and that this might be part of that community fall assessment. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think falls, and I know that Geoff and Ramiro will want to do their. Yes, absolutely falls, and that's where a big concern. But I think it's not just that population. I mean, this is, not just about older adults. This is not just about people with concussion. This is just not about people with dizziness. This is about people with sensory reweighting issues, which can be from pediatrics to geriatrics. And so really, how do we take this type of technology, because it gives us information about targeted treatment? Then, I mean, that's what we want, right? We want targeted treatment. So I think it's applicable for so many.
So speaking of that, it's going to give you a report, and it's going to compare to some kind of normative data, or what populations. Tell me about the validity, the reliability, and the information we know so far about.
Yeah. So I'd be happy to field that question. Since a lot of it happened right here in my lab, we started out simply by making sure that substituting head sway for center of pressure, so like a force plate, which was a more standard piece of equipment, validated that and made sure that the Pearson correlations were very high. Then we compared it directly on the same population between one of the gold standards out there, or the gold standard, which is the NeuroComs sensory organization test. And that's a well-known test that is a really fantastic piece of equipment. It's the size of a telephone booth, and unfortunately they're not making them anymore, but there are other people who are stepping into that space. So we validated against the NeuroCom. We showed very good correlation. In fact, we outperformed the NeuroCom on a couple things, because we were able to get more at that visual vestibular mismatch that virtual reality allows for us. Then we also compared it to important tests that clinicians usually use, which are your timed up and go, your Berg balance, and your Tonetti. All of those we were more sensitive than as far as detecting fall risk. So we've gone through a gamut of validation tests in order to make sure that what we're measuring is what we think we're measuring. So the criterion measure validity and all that statistics, which I love and I can go deep into if you want. And I think from that, we were able to calculate cutoff scores for older adults, adults with fall risk, for younger adults with concussion. We've done pilot tests on Parkinson's disease. We need to collect more data there. But vestibular populations we're working with, especially with some of our collaborators, and Bridgett is got her, she's got ready access for those. And so we've been talking with her about how she wants to use it and who she wants to test it on. So we have a number of really great university and clinical collaborators who are collecting even more normative or validating data for us as we speak.
What about kids? I know that this apparatus has some weight to it and a size to it. And I think when I hear my husband, who's a technologist, talk about VR headsets coming out for gaming, and the fact is nobody can keep them on their head for very long. While this is a short test, I see that. Is there an age cutoff, not only for reliability studies that you've done, but just who can have it on their head?
Yeah, that one's a good question. We're teamed up with one pediatric physical therapist right now who's doing some validation on pediatric concussion. But implicit in that as well, we would be collecting some healthy young adolescents. The weight of it is about 1.5 pounds, so it's rather light, but surprisingly, adding that weight, it affects how our brain sort of says, oh, well, something has changed about the mass of my head. I mean, we don't think about the mass of our head, which is exactly how our body works. We don't think about the weight of our arms or how much we weigh, except for when we're standing on our feet for a couple hours. But even that extra weight, luckily, these devices are sort of counterbalanced now, many of the ones that are available. So they can be worn for a fairly long time. Without too much problem, but every once in a while you'll meet a frail older adult or maybe a really young child who has a little bit difficulty managing. We haven't fully validated it on adolescents yet, but I have worked with very young adults, 18 and above, where we've done validation on them. But we do feel, I feel, at least from a validation perspective, that we can test a group of 30 adolescents, get those numbers. I don't suspect it's going to change at all because we're using a theoretical model as it is, and those use basic physics that should hold up for even for young children as well.
Well, that's a nice segue talking about teenagers or young adults and gamification, because they're going to put those on and go, what can I play?
Yeah.
And so you get information from the patient in an assessment. It helps guide your treatment. And then can this tool be used as part of your training session?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Who'd like to talk about gamification?
You want to jump on that one, Ramiro? You've had quite a bit of experience with the games.
Yeah. So going back to my therapy days, right? It was always, a test of your creativity of like, how do you get patients to participate and be compliant with their exercise programs or home exercise programs? And some of the things that I always kind of go back to is, the importance of games and play. I mean, like play is so important, especially as we're growing. I mean, play is effectively how we learn, right? So, and that doesn't really necessarily go away as you become an adult. You just kind of, all these other societal constraints come on top of you, and like play isn't viewed the same way as a learning experience any longer. But it is still a lot of, especially when it comes to motor learning, it's wonderful to gamify some of these aspects. So, one of the tried and true methods of vestibular therapy is retraining the VOR. And we're all very familiar with this exercise, having someone either look at a Post-it note or their finger and turning their head very quickly. And I mean, probably don't have to speak too much to the clinicians who probably question the compliance of this type of activity, especially when they're going home. When you gamify something, and Dr. Rada said this a couple times, it's kind of like taking your medicine with like a little bit of sugar, like you kind of do it while also not necessarily know that you're doing it. So we could make games like the VOR very exciting by putting them in an environment that's fun. So one game that we have is something called Dance Fever, which is it's kind of like a dance hall, and like we have a little beat going on in the background, and you have to notice a dancer at the end of the hall and how they're pointing their hand and things of that nature, making a game that's working on gaze stabilization in the VOR, but making it a lot more fun. Similar to that, we could work on activities similar to the VOR times 2, where we have a couple objects. And it's kind of the game that we have is called Chocolate Factory, and it's a nod to that favorite famous episode of I Love Lucy, where everything goes kind of wonky in the chocolate factory. So we have chocolate bars coming down one side, boxes going in a different direction on the other side, and you have to track that piece of chocolate with your eye and move it over to the box on the other side and let it go.
Are they using their arms too? I mean, they may not have sensors on them, but is this dynamic and involving the whole body, or are they still standing statically still?
So they can, for that game, it's very much so specific for the VOR. So I often find people end up using their hands for that. But that game specifically is very meant for just kind of, a gaze and movement and tracking of eyes. But we have other games. For instance, we have a game called Lucky Clover, which is, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow type of thing. Gold coins are coming at the individual, and now they have to use their hands to reach out for their gold coins as they reach outside of their limits of stability to really challenge their balance. And then there's also elements of trying to introduce, more optic flow, for individuals that may be a little bit more visually hypersensitive, right? So you could employ something called vection, which is the sensation that you're moving towards something. So you could turn that off, or you could turn it onto various levels of high, medium, or low. You could also increase visual stimulus by adding distractors to that screen to make it a very high, visually intense background, while also working on limits of stability. So we have games like that do employ full body use, and then we have games that work on stepping strategy, where you have to now step outside of your static balance and work on stepping strategy while you avoid things, and then also achieve obstacles in the game as well. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to kind of work on these activities, and gamification helps us to kind of pull someone out of just say, hey, I'm just doing like a boring exercise program, and now they're just working on it because they enjoy it and they enjoy working on it. And we find that people tend to stay in these games for much longer than they would if you were just working on a standard VOR type activity or standard just stepping strategy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's amazing.
And one thing that Ramiro has been integral in helping us design is the feedback that the clinician gets. So they're getting a quantification. They actually know if their patient's being compliant, and they're seeing how they performed on it, and they can use those graphs to say, well, I think that they've actually reached the ceiling now, and they're probably ready for the next level. And so you can, as a clinician, prescribe higher and higher levels. But even within the levels, it tracks automatically how well they're doing it, and it increases the difficulty. If they're doing super well, then it makes it harder and harder, and that's a pretty standard gamification technique.
That's interesting. You mentioned the portability of the unit and the gamification and patient compliance. Do you ever imagine these would be issued to a client or a patient to use in their home, or do you see them as a clinical tool only?
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'll touch on it a little bit. I mean, that's definitely something that we're excited about the use of, especially if as VR becomes more widely adopted. But there are, there's it's not like it's completely new, right? There's a group called XR Health, which sends virtual reality headset units to patients' homes so they could go through more generalized physical therapy or things of that nature. So there exists definitely a world where we see we just have to figure out what that model looks like, where either if the patient already owns a headset, is there a way to kind of get our programs onto that headset, or do we ship them a headset? Do they purchase it? Do they rent it? So there's ways to kind of work it out, but we very much see a world where this could very much so be done within a patient's home. They take it home, after a physical therapy visit, whatever it may be, and it could definitely perform games in a seated position. So there's as far as safety issues, we could get around that, especially if they're working on more so motion sensitivity issues and not true just balance issues. But yeah, we are very much so see a world where this can be something that is at home with the patient or goes home with the patient, so they could continue working on it in a home setting with that gamified rehab.
Hopefully it'll be something like a TENS unit that used to be $900 to buy a TENS unit, and now you can get it for $9.90.
Right.
Oh, wow. That would be great.
And everyone can buy one, So I remember it was true. My first, we called it, NMES unit was $900.
Yeah.
So maybe it will come down in price and people can have them. So that's great. Are there other things? Were you going to say something, Geoff?
No, I think Ramiro summed it up pretty well. We actually are. So I guess in the business world, they call it B2B, business to business. And so we are currently putting these in clinics and in clinicians' hands, and also in retirement communities where they're managed by whoever the staff is there. But Ramiro really did hit on it. I mean, these things are so portable that and the price is getting down there. They're not $9 yet, though. I can't wait until they are. But they are, headsets are becoming affordable enough that a clinician could possibly own a dozen of these and have a few of them out in the clinic, in the homes of their patients. And the patients who are, you send them home with a TheraBand right now, or you send them home with to go to the pharmacy to get a prescription. Well, this would simply be one additional piece that they would take home with them. And then on their next visit, they'd come back. You'd have access to all their data, which currently you actually can get access to their data through the cloud. But the gaming data is still requires you to bring the headset back. So yeah, very much so. The likelihood exists in when I say near future, I'm talking we're working on this model so that it could be implemented by the end of the year, or maybe by within a year or so.
So you're saying that you could have a remote visit with your client. They could have the unit, and you could be somewhere else, and you can get access to their data through the cloud.
Yeah.
Well, that's my treatment model too, anyway. So, I mean, that's amazing. And so that's really, really neat. So for those people who are watching, who are patients, I'm sure there's going to be people saying, how do I get one? And how do we direct not only therapists who want one from their clinic, since you're doing B2B, there's going to be patients who we're going to, I guess, ask them to ask their vestibular rehab specialist about it. And
yeah, that would be great. Honestly, as a new company, we've been around for a couple of years now, but really the more the word spreads as to patients asking for it, and clinicians also knowing and having it. And I think the more we've gone out there and gone to conferences and talked with clinicians, and because I've worked, I mean, my training for the last 20 years has been with clinicians. And so they have been guiding my thinking, and their feedback has been, I can't say just how invaluable. It really is dictated by what their patients need and what the clinicians think that they can incorporate into their clinical pipeline. And so we've really listened to their feedback to say, what is the barrier to you adding a piece of technology to your clinic? And oftentimes it has to be easy to use, and I have to somehow see that I'm going to get really improved results with my patients, and time saving. And of course, the word ROI, return on investment, is important to business owners like Bridgett, who needs to know that this is something that is actually going to be better for her patients and also not cost an arm and a leg.
That's awesome. So the therapist can design the treatments, modify the games that the patient experiences. Bridgett, tell us about how you might use this to create a treatment plan for a patient, and can you control what they're doing and modify that as they progress?
Yeah, sure. I think, I had mentioned the reports earlier. So, that story, when you test someone, that story starts there because it breaks it down. How did they do when they were depending on somatosensory? How did they do on vestibular, visual, those components, and visual vestibular mismatch?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, it starts there, and patients want to know. They want to know about their test results. Why are you doing this test? And I think they're interested in the history of the test. I mean, what we do in vestibular today, testing comes from traveling more to space, and so talking about the inner ear. So I think all of that. I'm just a big believer that you have to start with the patient's story, utilize those test results, and then be like, okay, this is how we get to customize. We don't need to do this. We're going to focus on this component. Or utilizing it, did they use a startle response, like I mentioned earlier, throughout the treatment? Maybe our treatment is doing something pretty low key without a startle response and a nice quality of movement pattern. Because we do use it. We don't want to see startle responses no matter what test. If we're testing someone with a clinical bedside test, or it doesn't matter. We don't want to see that, and that becomes a priority with our treatment. And I think they understand that. That's how we guide their whole programs, is through the startle response. So to me, it's a nice way to take the assessments, customize, and an opportunity to educate the patient.
If you can consistently expose them to an environment, or repeatedly expose them to something, and train the brain to accept that as a part of what is reality or virtual reality, but still that repeated exposure opportunity is helpful. And I'm thinking about really the benefit of use in a virtual reality for motion sensitivity, which is one of those harder things for us to address. We have people who are functioning at a high level, but they just don't feel right because they just are overstimulated by movement of the surround and environmental movement. That crosses a lot of diagnoses too, from concussion to vestibular migraines and more, MDDS. Do you see just a whole world of opportunity with virtual reality coming in? I mean, I think the future looks bright.
Well, yeah, and one of those really rare conditions, which if you have it, it can be extremely debilitating, is is I'm going to say the French word. I think it's well, no, I'll call it disembarkment sickness. It's mal du débarquement, and that one for many years people just suffer with it for years. They go on a boat ride and then they get back to land and they're forever changed in a bad way. And virtual reality has this ability to really habituate the visual and vestibular processing in ways that right now I think there's some groups in across the country that are trying to treat them using virtual reality. And so that is an area where virtual reality is unique from other interventions in that it immerses you in a visual environment that can also be used to interact with your vestibular system and requires your proprioceptive system as well, because you're balancing your body. So it's a unique tool. It really is. It's certainly not the cure to everything, but it really is ideal for visual vestibular processing.
We have an international audience watching. So is it available globally, or is this just in the United States at this time?
Right now, it's just in the U.S. Actually, we just got a Canadian distributor, so we're starting to move to our northern North American place. But we've been in close contact and creating partnerships with people in Israel, and then Europe would be probably our next step. So yeah, we're hoping that we can make ourselves available. There's always these regulatory barriers that you have to go through in order to be able to put clinical devices out there.
Well, I want to make sure that without further ado, we show them how they can get in touch with you. And we have on the Vestibular Disorders Association website an UprightVR information request form, which we have a picture of. We can show people what that looks like. If you go here at vestibular.org/UprightVR, you can fill out your information and you can connect with UprightVR directly. Also, ask your vestibular physical therapist when they'll have one in their clinic for you to use as well. And I want to make sure I give you guys an opportunity to say anything else. And I think we'll look at some comments and questions.
Sure.
And I think just one add for me, Kathleen, is and I've talked to Geoff and Ramiro about this, is I'm also super interested because we do the full vestibular diagnostics too, VNG and VEMP and VHIT, and I'm super interested in otolith function, subjective visual vertical, that kind of thing. And this new condition that they have with the role, I'm really interested in how we can take these kind of tests and pair them with the vestibular diagnostic findings. I mean, obviously our goal is that patients feel better. But I'm also interested in the kind of correlations that we can see with testing. And I think there's going to be maybe I really think there's some unknowns here, possibly with this new condition and the role and what's happening with otoliths.
So does this have a segment or a training segment for vertical alignment?
Yeah. So what we're working on right now, we have about 10 different additional assessments, and included among them are our ability to measure the eyes, and so video oculography. And also, even without video oculography, we can get good measurements of where the gaze is by testing for acuity while doing a dynamic test.
Wow, that's good.
So the subjective visual vertical goes back to the rod and frame test. There's a number of those, and those tests are also being validated. We've used those in the laboratory for years, and the things going from my laboratory into something that we want to put in user-friendly way out in the clinician's hands. It's surprisingly, because I've got a great staff of like technologists and programmers and researchers, it works every time. And then you put it out in a clinic and it's like, okay, this has to be perfect. So we're moving those. But some of Bridgett's tests, we're doing correlations with some of our lab-based tests that we want to put into this product. And that will add to the clinician's ability to really look at specific peripheral, so the actual vestibular system, the actual visual system, and then tie that in with these functional outcomes like a balance test or a gait test.
That sounds great. So there's more to come. You're going to be having upgrades and updates. And when you buy
Absolutely.
it, do you have access to download updates as you add
Yeah.
features?
Yeah,
I'll
that's
let Ramiro speak to that.
that's a great thing that we're offering right now, and currently have no plans of changing it anytime soon. Effectively, as a thank you to people that you know, adopt us early on. As we make this more of a powerful tool, you get to wake up and you have this new assessment on your headset. You have this new game on your headset. And as we continue to grow this library, you just have this ever growing and expanding tool at your disposal. And, that's just kind of how we plan to operate for now and for some time.
That's amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. And we've covered the gamut of it, and I'm excited that people got to see it and see the pictures of it in the introduction, and that they got to hear, and they can contact you and leave their information. And don't forget to go see them at UprightVR.com for information. The website has everything in it you could imagine, including some videos and some things to watch and see what this company looks like, how it's being innovative, and really just an incredible team of technologists and smart neuroscience to bring it all together. This is the time to be in the vestibular rehab field, because the technology is catching up. It's very, very exciting. I thank you so much for being here, and hope you'll come back and give us an update on UprightVR as it gets out there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathleen. And thanks for joining us, Bridgett, one of our best customers.
One of our favorites out there. Bridgett, we appreciate you. And Ramiro, we appreciate you for what you've done as well. Thank you all, and take care. Join us again on Making Vestibular Visible. And remember, we need and depend your financial support for the Vestibular Disorders Association. So come see us at the website at vestibular.org, and have a wonderful day. Go to vestibular.org for more videos like this one. Also there, you'll find information, support, and encouragement to help you find your journey back to balance.